Hello, everyone. Today is November 22nd, and this is going to be the inaugural session for the OLM V1 GitHub project planning initiative. For those of you that don't know, OLM is being reimagined as a series of components that basically provide the same the same workflow for installing, well, the same experience in terms of the goal of the project. We're going to still be installing operators, from off cluster repositories, but the goal is to reinvent OLM as a series of smaller components that will be very, very focused and doing certain things. Two examples of this are RecPack, which is responsible for retrieving off-cluster content and applying it to the cluster. And then another example is Depi, which is basically a generic SAT solver. And specifically, OLM is going to be using that in order to identify and satisfy constraints on installation of bundles. So you could imagine that as my operator has a dependency on operator B, and Depi is going to be used to identify that operator B needs to be installed. Likewise, it will handle some of the upgrade logic in terms of your current version into the next version. And so we wanted to make this process visible and inclusive upstream. And so what we've ultimately landed on right now, and this is, you're welcome to have opinions and share them, but generating a backlog in this operator framework project number 8, where we would generate individual items of work that need to be done. And then those items of work would be assigned to a series of milestones. In this case, here's an example of milestone 1. So we'd populate the to-do section, and then the work would be tracked as it gets in progress and eventually move to the done column. We probably want a code review process as well to let people give feedback. And then we also created a general availability milestone, which is simply something to catch like, hey, I've been working on an issue for milestone 1. And when I was implementing that feature, I quickly hacked something together that we need to go back and fix before this thing can be released. And this is basically items that end up here will prevent GA from happening of OLM V1. So like those tickets could then be pulled into separate milestones or just continue to track there. I think that's pretty easy. You might be wondering how we're going to have these. If you create an issue, how does it show up in milestone 1? We are proposing that we use a labeling system on the issues. So OLM-V1 milestone 1 is the example for issues that would show up in the milestone 1 view. You could imagine that OLM-V1/M2 would correspond with milestone 2, and then the GA label is slightly different with OLM-V1/GA. There is a milestone feature that we could have used in order to group these things, but as we discussed just a second ago, the OLM V1 is really going to be composed of multiple projects, and so we didn't want to introduce a requirement for those individual projects like RecPack and Depi to mirror the OLM V1 milestones, and instead, when we're creating an issue, if there's an existing issue for a RecPack that OLM V1 requires for milestone 1, you can actually search the RecPack, and then you can find the individual issue that you want to add to this backlog and assign it to the milestone. And the RecPack doesn't need to individually assign these to certain milestones in order for them to show up, which is nice. Likewise, we can also create our own issues in real time. So I could create a var issue, and then it exists, and then I need to convert it to an issue once it's ready to be assigned. I believe you have to assign it to a specific repository. I don't think if it's I think there was some discussion in terms of like where we might track something that's specific to OLM V1, whether it's tracking this operator lifecycle manager repo or a new area. We can have that as a discussion later. And finally, we've got a README, which currently consists of a couple scenarios that just get the ball rolling. We can read through it and discuss it. But basically, it outlines milestone 1 and what we want to do. And the milestones we're proposing are basically split into some targeted workflow, some E to E thing that proves that we're making progress, and it allows us to collect feedback on the experience and possibly course correct if something is ever off. So with all of that said, I just wanted to give a quick overview of where we're at right now and allow people to give some quick feedback on the proposed process and raise any objections or concerns. So feel free to speak up. Okay, I can't really see my main screen while I'm sharing, so if anyone wants to speak up and isn't able to, please just let me know in chat.
Sure, I'll go ahead and ask my question. So for OLM V1, is milestone 1 specifically going to be focused on things like RuckPack and DEPI? Or are other tooling that we've created, like an example is Araya operator, is that also going to be considered one of the foundational pieces, or how are we structuring some of those things?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think we need to get into a like a headspace where instead of asking, is that what we're going to do? Each of you propose what you think we should be doing for each milestone, right? And helping us decide what's going to be the milestone. So in my opinion, I probably wouldn't immediately integrate with the Araya operator, simply because the Araya operator is targeted at configuring an operator to watch a set of namespaces, where today we can't even install a operator with the new API, right? So I would rather see that we have the process for installing something created first, and then creating, and then pulling more Araya in. But I don't want to be prescriptive in what I'm doing. But so I'm encouraging you, if you think that Araya operator should be in that milestone 1, to push back on me. So I think that like my biggest request is if we all get in the headspace of like critically thinking and deciding what we should be doing for each milestone and feeling empowered to defend your position and impact the project, I'd love to see that.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense, and I agree with what you're saying. I think Araya operator was probably a bad example for me to say, but that was the first thing that came to my mind. But no, that all makes sense. I'm just trying to gauge like what the existing headspace of the people that were involved in creating this community-facing project and created this first milestone we're kind of thinking. So
yeah, great.
Nice.
So yeah, I'll take a stab at this because I wrote this milestone like just this morning, kind of just off the top of my head. So in my mind, I pretty much agree with what Alex said in terms of like let's do the tiniest minimal thing that like lets us show something. And to be frank, like I don't think the Araya operator stuff is included in the tiniest minimal thing. But what is included in the tiniest minimal thing is something that tells DEPI, what are the available bundles and packages, and we don't have that piece yet. And I think that's probably something that, so we have like this ecosystem team and the runtime team, right? So I imagine that the ecosystem team for this milestone 1, like we're going to swarm on the catalog source, DEPI source side of the equation and make sure that like what we swarm on there is going to satisfy milestone 1, right? And then let's say we get to milestone 1 and that all works, then we'll talk about like, okay, what's milestone 2? At some point, you know, Arai is going to enter the equation and then that'll be the focus. But I would imagine that the first few milestones are probably focused more on installation, upgrade, that sort of thing. And Arai comes in when we think that like all of that stuff works, and now we want to start banging on, you know, what does it mean to be descoped, and how does a cluster admin integrate and say what their opinion is of how an operator should be able to function in the cluster and that kind of thing. I don't know if that makes sense. And I would just second what Alex said, like if anyone else has different opinions on the way we should approach it, like this is the place to talk about it.
Yeah, 100%. And I think one thing I just want to like, state is that we're having these meetings because we want the project to be community driven. We want to give you that voice. We want to give you that ability to direct the project. So we have a lot of opinions. People who have been working on OLM V0, the existing one that's out in the wild and used by people all over the world. And we'll represent those opinions, but just because we've been in that space and we know like common pitfalls that we're actively trying to avoid in the new set of components that make up OLM V1. So but we also are acknowledging that like the community has to be able to have some ability to direct the project, and so the decisions we make in terms of how we're designing OLM V1, is going to be an aggregation of what we all come to agreement on.
Yeah, I think that's a great statement, Alex. I would encourage to maybe take an approach from the angle of to whom is this potentially useful? So you often hear these discussions about what a minimum viable product is. I would like to invite a discussion about the minimum usable product or the minimum usable version of OLM. So maybe we do not look at the milestones at particular building blocks of when certain subcomponents are ready, but certain user desires can be addressed with OLM V1. So in the beginning, we might actually want to target users that don't really need that many features, because then the milestone will be very far out. But let's say you talk about a user who has a cluster and that's controlled by GitOps, and they want to leverage OLM to install cluster extensions, right? What would they need, right? And they would probably need something very close to what's currently in milestone 1. But rather than thinking in components and like what part of our sub-projects are ready yet, maybe let's think about how useful is this to a certain persona, right? And then these personas get more complex and they want to know more about the system. They need more signals and feedback from the system and more configurability. But maybe focus more about the actual users rather than how we structure our project. That helps to delineate, when is it a good time to call something a milestone? Because I think what we want to do as a project when we release a milestone is we want to collect feedback from people that are maybe not part of this group on day-to-day, right? But they are heavily leveraging the operator framework. So what do these people think about? We want to have a point in time to reflect and digest that feedback, discuss it, and maybe even change course in regards to one of the following milestones.
That makes a lot of sense to me, Daniel. It sounds like you're kind of implying that like each milestone should have at least like one primary user story associated with it. Like this one seems like it would be like, as a cluster admin, I can use the operator API to install an operator from a catalog, right? Like, is that sufficient?
Much. Yeah, or the user story maybe is some sort of integration story that another software framework has. But I think just calling a couple of our subsystems ready and then leaving it out there as milestone 1 while it's not really fulfilling or addressing a certain need, that's not going to get us the feedback that we want. That's not going to invite the collaboration that we are seeking here. We need to release something that's more tangible and saying, now you can do this. And what this is something that we probably want to discuss and define further and get feedback on. But it needs to be sort of tangible, right?
Yeah, and I kind of think that like this very first milestone is probably going to be a one-off, because we just need to get a lot of stuff in place, right? And then once we have that stuff in place, then it's probably much easier and smaller scope to say, okay, the next milestone, like it's just a more incremental change than like this first one, which is like we just need the bits in the place to actually be able to deploy to a cluster, and we have the base level components that we know we're going to need for the future milestones. So I don't know if you kind of feel the same way, or if others kind of feel that like, I don't know.
I think you could even attach a use case to something as very basic as this, right? And if you think about someone who is using something like GitOps to deploy an operator or any kind of extension, and the type of cluster they're deploying to is single tenant, right? That already kind of ticks a lot of boxes on what's currently in milestone 1. And just so to communicate better what's now possible with this, right? You can use the front-end API that we have to install an extension. It comes from a catalog. You see when it's installed, you see if the install was successful or unsuccessful, and all that kind of integrates nicely in your GitOps style workflow. I think that would set a goal that's not too far off of milestone 1 here, but still has sort of a user or persona component in it, rather than just let's finish a bunch of libraries and make them sort of end-to-end usable in one step.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the main thing that, I mean, well, not the main thing, but like one of the important things that I think we should also try to do is limit scope, right? Like, obviously we want to get to the point where, you know, we've got all of the, you know, the entire V1 requirements done. But the smaller we can scope the incremental work, that I think the easier it'll be to, you know, show the like, well, A, like make progress, right? And B, get that feedback that you're saying that we need, which I totally agree with. But like every time we get to a milestone, we can say like, okay, like we solved that use case for that set of personas. What do we think is the next most valuable thing? And part of that decision process is going to be, what was the feedback we got for that previous milestone? Like if everyone is saying like, oh, you know, I really need to be able to specify the catalog name in the operator API, then great, like let's go and make that the next milestone and we'll work on it. And so like if we do it like on such a small scale, like it might be easier to focus on what the highest priority things are and swarm around those things as they come up. So I guess maybe part of the point I'm trying to make is, and I don't know if anybody really even touched on this, but now that I kind of walk through my thinking on that, like I don't necessarily think we should try to define what milestone 2 is yet. Like let's get to milestone 1, get some feedback about it. And once we know what that feedback is, then we know what milestone 2 probably should be. And maybe we can go 1 milestone in the future, right? Like maybe it's not just nothing. But and this I think gets on one of the points in the agenda about like how far in advance should we plan. And in my mind, like probably not that far in terms of like actual issues that we should work on, because the further we try to plan, the less, you know, the less we know about what exactly we need to do, which makes things less actionable. We build a backlog that becomes kind of crusty over time. So I feel like having a really slim, really well-focused backlog with like a very strict set of 1 or 2 future milestones is probably the best way to make sure that we're always focused on, you know, the highest priority things that need to be done next for OLM V1. That's my 2 cents.
I would probably vote to have 1 more milestone on the roadmap, just to give sort of the impression that there's a runway towards a greater or larger picture. So that's something that I had in my mind, is something around starting really simple, very close to what is written here in milestone 1, where we have the ability to declaratively install an extension and remove an extension. That's something that mostly everybody wants, right? And somebody who's not interacting with the cluster with a console or a CLI client will definitely want to do that. And then there's nothing more, right? There's no discovery for end users. There's no permission management because the cluster is single tenant. And there's also no constraint resolution yet, maybe because we aren't like looking at operators that depend on each other yet. And then slowly but steadily, we expand on these additional aspects in the future milestones. So maybe the next milestone is about, well, now we have somebody on the cluster that is not privileged enough to know what extensions are installed. So maybe we need to now make milestone 2 about how does a non-cluster admin user know that an operator is installed, right? Or maybe we think about it in the sense that now that there are multiple tenants on the cluster, maybe now this is a good time to think about Aurea as a permission management solution. Or the next step is we allow to install more complex operator groups in this sense with constraint resolution. But having one more on the list than just the one we are currently working towards to kind of shapes the larger picture and forces us to think about where we want to go with this, so that we're not just heads down and making one like use case work, but we also keep in mind, yeah, later we need to definitely add something like that allows the normal user to add discovery, right? How does a normal user know that an extension has been installed and is available to them, right? How do they get permissions and all that? So all these things kind of come into play as you start going further on the user journey. And I think we should definitely look at the user journey a little bit farther ahead than just one step. But we should definitely be open and flexible in terms of what's going to be the next milestone. That's kind of how we do feedback and how we get feedback in, right?
Yeah, I agree with all that. That makes sense to me. I think maybe the key thing in my mind is that backlog hygiene, right? And Jesus kind of alluded to this in the chat, but like if we just have an issue that says like, I want to do X, and we say, well, that's not milestone 1, and we just then put it in the next milestone because we're not working on that milestone yet, that's probably not the right answer unless we're constantly looking at, you know, like, is that story really something we want to do as part of milestone 2? So we should really have a really good idea of what maybe the high level milestone scenario should be for the next milestone. But like we only put stories in there, like issues in there, if those are actually going to contribute to the milestone. And if we get something that comes up that like isn't something that we want to do for one of the milestones, I guess I'd probably say like either just leave it in the backlog or put it in the GA milestone, depending on how critical we think it is to the final picture of things. But those sorts of things, that's the stuff that like gets out of date quickly and, you know, maybe isn't something that's relevant after a couple of milestones are complete. So it's tough, right? Because you want to balance, like we need to make sure we capture all the things that we come across, but you know, we don't want to work on things that aren't super high priority either. So I don't know, we have to, well, I think that'll just be a thing that we'll have to handle on a case-by-case basis. And I think the best way to do that is just to be constantly refining our backlog and, you know, looking at issues that we haven't touched in, 3 weeks or a month or something like that.
One way that we could compromise on the idea of like being forward-looking versus being clean in the backlog is like we could start thinking about milestones. We don't even need to think of them as necessarily milestones, but we just need to be continuing to go back to a single document that kind of outlines where we want to end up eventually. And that way we can have like a vision that we're all sharing, something that a shared goal that we're moving towards. And then the milestones can be like, this is how we're going to do it in the real world.
Yeah, I think part of it though is having enough of these issues in the backlog aligned to the like the next immediate milestone or two, such that like we can pick them up and those are the priority things to work on, versus, oh yeah, like this issue is something that's related to functional requirement number 10 and we haven't talked anything about working on that. And so somehow like I don't want to work on that until we get to the point that there's a milestone that says we need to work on that. You know what I mean? Like, if we have stuff in the backlog that's not aligned to our immediate priorities, then that risks those things being worked on out of order potentially.
I totally agree. That's why I'm thinking like we wouldn't even put those issues in a backlog necessarily initially, but we would put the general idea in a document somewhere.
I mean, maybe think about it from the perspective of someone who's interested to use this project or to contribute to it even. You all are in this position every day almost, right? So we all are kind of working with other open source projects, most likely in GitHub. What's the best or most pleasing experience that we and the consuming side would want to have? How would we like somebody else, some other project treat our request, idea, problem, challenge? And maybe orient around that as kind of a way to organize feedback into this upcoming set of milestones and sort stuff that's not really aligning with one of those milestones yet.
It seems like creating a generic issue or something that captures like milestone 2 proposal so that people can make proposals in terms of the user experiences that should be completed as a part of milestone 2 might be a good way to kind of allow people to give feedback and outline what they think should be in the next milestone, but doesn't cause us to populate a backlog that could become stale if we kind of pivot. I can imagine halfway through milestone 1, what we think we're going to do in milestone 2 is one thing, but as we get to the end of milestone 1, we're like, well, we really need to address this thing, so we're going to do something different for milestone 2, and now that item doesn't make sense. So I think creating a top level ticket to take kind of proposals in terms of, or even just a discussion, right? Like GitHub discussion is a good opportunity too, but allow people to give feedback what they think should be completed in the next milestone.
Yeah, I was going to suggest something similar to that, like maybe just having another label for like milestone proposal or something like that. Because I'm sure we have like lots of ideas. Like right now we're targeting the main installation and uninstallation flow. Then maybe the next thing is, the upgrade flow. Then maybe the next thing is dependencies and handling the installation flow and all those kinds of things. We could just trying to keep track of those as special issues on on the project, and then as we nearing the end of milestone 1, we can come together and say, okay, what's the next thing that would probably add more value? Maybe it's in that trove. Maybe we find something new that we didn't know, and it's something new entirely, and then we can decide together what the next step is.
Yeah, I definitely think with whichever medium we take to collect that feedback, it needs to, the milestone needs to be discussed and defined in one of these types of meetings, right? So creating some pool of suggested focuses for the upcoming milestone makes sense to me. And then, deciding on the focus of the milestone from that proposed pool in an upstream meeting where everyone has an opportunity to kind of weigh in makes sense. Kind of like what we're doing here.
So another thing that I would suggest we start thinking about is how do we want to validate these milestones? How do we want to collect feedback? Who are we collecting feedback from? Is it just from the community itself? Do we have specific users that we want to or that we have access to that could try it out and give us feedback and so on?
I would love it if we could get OKD in on the ground floor here.
One thing I would consider is if you do like demos of it, you put up videos, you spread the word about it as far as you can, you'll get feedback that way. That will probably open up some other doors of folks that are interested. Definitely bring it up to all the different community meetings. I think you just have to kind of cast your net and see how folks will get you, see what the reaction is. It kind of starts to vet if your idea is good or not, and giving them things to play with in between will also help. Hey, here, how to download this. This is how you can also play, stuff like that. But yeah, cast your net.
After this crystallizes just a little bit so that it's like not quite so open-ended, I think it would be really beneficial to write a blog post about the plan, how we're going to get this moving forward in the upstream, etc. Post it on opensource.com, share that around. We may be able to find people who want this, who just aren't aware that we're doing this because they don't come to community meetings.
Yeah.
Nice. Great suggestions.
Yeah, I was going to mention that if like we have this, if we put like end-to-end kind of documentation like for each milestone, that yeah, just kind of piggybacking on that blog post idea, like even if it's, you know, milestone 1, here it is, trying to find either opensource.com or, you know, I don't know if there's any like CNCF blogs where we could try to find guest posts or something like that, but I think that could be a way that maybe the operator framework documentation team could contribute and help kind of get that feedback and kind of drive home these kind of end-to-end stories.
All right, so it definitely seems like what we're suggesting is that there needs to be a way to collect feedback on milestones as they get released. I think that's something we can track as a ticket in milestone 1, you know, as a release criteria. So perhaps we create a ticket, assign it to someone to lead that initiative, simply because I think, you know, like what that process looks like might take a little while to decide. So I don't necessarily want to get stuck on this issue here, if that makes sense.
I think I would suggest that we just say like, here's what we're going to try, and we just go and do it. And then part of the community, you know, meetings are kind of retros, right? Like, well, that didn't seem like it worked. Let's do this other thing.
Right, but how are we going to just define what we're going to try? Like, how do we want to do that? Do we want to create that as a ticket to define what we're going to try, or do we just want to do it haphazardly, like off the cuff?
I think it probably makes sense to like put a time limit on deciding, right? Like, let's say that within the next, let's make an issue or whatever we want to do to try to organize our thoughts, and then say, okay, by, you know, end of next week or whatever we decide, like whatever, you know, whatever seems like the best option there, someone will make a decision and say like, that's what we'll do. And then at that point going forward, you know, that might not be the best decision, but we'll put it into practice. And if the community sees that it's not ideal, then we'll have the discussions and we can tweak the process.
Okay.
So
does anyone want to?
one way of phrasing this that I think can summarize is it's lazy consensus. Like, we can be talking, come up with ideas. Yes, that sounds like a good idea. We're just going forward with it. And we don't necessarily need to get, yes, I agree from everybody, but if you don't agree, do please speak up and make sure that you're heard. But I don't think we need to like vote or, you know, drive things in a very slow way. We can just move fast and speak up if we have a problem.
Yep. Okay, does anybody want to create this issue? Which I guess we can do that as our first issue we create. How's that sound? Okay, before I close this, is everybody okay with this user story? As a cluster admin, I can install and uninstall an extension through the operator API.
Question. So do we envision to have I think I generally agree that, you know, for now, or specifically milestone 1, the operator probably will be always looking at, you know, cluster scope. But I just wonder that I agree that namespace scope, workflow probably won't be the milestone one, but I just wonder, do we kind of envision that the ORIA operator, that UX will be a part of the default operator install UX? In that sense, that should we still include that ORIA operator, but now maybe not focus on the namespace use case, but just still include that into the installation flow, but just always configure that as a cluster scope for milestone one. And then we can start to tease out the use case that, okay, if I want to scope that down to a specific or particular set of namespace, and then this is how you do it. So that kind of tease out the idea of that is something, a part of the installation flow. But then how do we actually configure the scope change that will be probably happening in the later stage? I just want to see how you guys think, or how we actually treat that scoping, how serious we want to treat that scoping concept of this installation flow. And don't want to make it look like this is an optional things that people can either opt in or opt out, or maybe not treat it as the default UX.
Yeah, so my concern with putting that in right now is we don't even have, like right now, the RecPad operator has only a concept of it's installing whatever the bundle is, right? It doesn't have anything beyond that. And you could technically put like the scope template or something in there, but I'm afraid that by like putting this in right now, we're inflating the scope of the milestone. And I really want to avoid doing that. I would really like to have as tightly scoped of a milestone as we can, so we can get something out in front of people and start collecting feedback. And by pushing this into it from the default right now, that seems like we just are inflating it. And we like, when I'm sure, I don't want to include something in the build process that people are going to see when they install it, and then they're going to be like, I can't do anything with this yet. We shouldn't artificially inflate it just so that it's in front of users early on if it can't do anything yet. Because I really want to do this quickly. I think OLM has suffered from a slow development release cycle, and it's because of forever increasing scope in terms of what needs to be delivered at some point. And I'm just always going to say, like, do we need this in order to get feedback on something we have decided as a group that we want to deliver? So those are my views.
Yeah, just to kind of pile on what I put in the chat, in my mind, like we should probably do design work for, like, okay, so this is kind of what Daniel was getting at too. Like, okay, so we want to have the next milestone kind of in front of us and know sort of what it is, so that we can go and start doing some of that design work, right? Like, I think we have a really good idea of how we're going to implement this first milestone. We've done a lot of the initial design. We have a pretty good idea of what the actual implementation is going to look like. So we can actually, like, this milestone one, I think, is very actionable. We can just go and start doing this. I think the ORIA operator stuff is not that yet, right? Like, okay, we somehow need to like make something visible to an operator author to put in their bundle, and we somehow need to give the cluster admin a way of tweaking that. Like, none of that I don't think we have. And if we think that milestone 2 is adding that in, then like, okay, let's go write milestone 2 for what we think we want it to do, and then we can start designing what we're actually going to do. Maybe we do some of the design for the next milestone while we're working on the previous one. But maybe another kind of thing to say here is that, like, I don't think anyone is under any impression that like every milestone is going to touch every single component that we're working on. Like, I think, well, in my opinion, what we should try to do is have these milestones be as small as possible. And some of them might only touch one component at a time. And if we can do 3 milestones in, in 3 weeks, that's great. Like now we've got 3 different places to collect feedback about. So in my mind, just like the more targeted we can make these user stories for the milestones, the better. It just keeps us moving and keeps us getting feedback as quickly as we can.
So I hear what Alex and Joe are saying, and the thing that's standing out to me is that it sounds like, at least from the conversation that we've had before, is that if Aki or anybody else have an opinion about why certain things should be included in the milestone, we should probably have an avenue to have that discussion. And I don't necessarily know, for example, if we need to have the discussion about Oriya order right now. But I think the thing that stands out from me from Aki's question is, what's the avenue for us to discuss that? Maybe that's something that we can probably take away from that conversation. Instead of us being super prescriptive about it, is what I'm trying to say.
Yep, big +1. And I'm going to create a action item. Actually, an action item to create a ticket that create an issue. Sorry. Track how milestone suggestions are made. Right? Like we just need a way for people to suggest it, because we just need to codify that, like have the process well defined so people have that opportunity to voice their opinion. Do you agree, Anik? Is this like enough of a step so that we can get to towards that?
Yes, for sure. And I think there's a bunch of things in the chat too. So I think we are in agreement. Majority of us.
Cool. And I know we're coming on the last quarter of the meeting, and I think we're starting to collect like we've started to address this open question: how far into the future do we plan? So we're talking right now, we're talking milestone 1, and then like creating the means to propose something for the upcoming milestone, right? So that's, and I think we're all aligned there. Does anyone have any objection to just like with the general atmosphere where that landed? Okay. Beyond that, I think I should probably answer this third question first. In terms of collecting, the ideal avenue for collecting feedback. So I think we want to drive a lot of conversations through the issues and the tickets, but I think there will be a need to have async conversations. I kind of recommend using the Slack channel of the individual components and probably the OLM dev Slack channel for questions that need to pop up.
That makes sense to me.
Okay, so I'm just going to add that. So async communication should be driven through Kubernetes Slack channels. If anyone has time, you just add like the OLM dev, Ruckpack dev, dev. So these are hashes. And then in terms of synchronous communication, I guess this was a kind of a one-off meeting. I was hoping to just schedule a recurring meeting until we really have milestone 1 fleshed out. I don't think our existing meeting time, just once a week on Thursday, is going to allow us to move quickly enough. So is there any strong opinions or time preferences as to when we'd have this meeting? Is now a good time? Should we push it back an hour? What's do you guys want to meet every day? Do you want to meet twice a week, 3 times a week? What are we thinking?
I would probably say that maybe we want 2 sorts of meetings, right? Like this sort of meeting where we're talking about like milestone level stuff. maybe once a week to start out. But then like day-to-day story breakdown within that milestone for Deppy and Ruckpack and Raya and whatever we're working on, right? Like that probably, maybe that should happen more often. Like I almost think of it like almost constant refinement and Kanban-y style of stuff where like we get together, we look at what's on the milestone. It's almost like I don't know, it's not really a stand-up, but like what's on the milestone, what's in progress, what did we close, what are we going to do next? Let's quickly type out the next title of the thing that we're going to do, and just like keep things chugging along. And I feel like it might be good to have two separate venues for that because you want to make sure that you have time for both.
Can we use our existing issue triage working group meeting to do the milestone discussions once a week, and then we can do a more dev-centric breakdown of the stories on a day-to-day basis? We could probably flesh that out in, we could create like a poll on the hashtag OLM dev channel, and then we could figure out when we want to do that on a daily basis. We could just set a recurring meeting.
If everyone kind of agrees that the existing meeting is okay to co-opt again into this milestone discussion, that seems fine to me. But if we think that the existing sort of scope of that meeting needs to stick around, then maybe we want yet another one. But it's always a balance, right? Like you don't want to have your days filled with meetings either. So I don't have a strong opinion. I'm just talking sort of experiences that I've had. So whatever folks think is going to be the most productive, it's fine with me.
That seems fine for initial implementation to me.
Okay, so we'll use the working group portion of the currently scheduled upstream meeting to talk about milestone stuff. And then we'll, in regards to the day-to-day story breakdown and generation and making sure everything's healthy, we're going to have to be meeting pretty frequently. Do you want me just to schedule a 30-minute recurring call at this time where we can do that every day to start generating it? Or do you think we'll need more time?
I wonder, like, do we think that we want to have like the entire group of everyone meeting to talk about that? It almost seems like we kind of sort of delegate down and say like, okay, well, we talked about the milestone stuff at the working group meeting. Now each of the different projects go off and do your own sort of lower level refinement and backlog building.
I'm fine with that second one.
Yeah,
I just think we should announce it when we're doing it, so you monitor, the Slack channel, and then we'll just say, hey, we're jumping in a huddle to start building this up or whatever.
So just for clarification, when we say working group meeting, are we talking about the OLM working group, or are we talking about like the steering committee open meeting?
OLM working group.
Cool.
Okay, so we'll leave it up to something along those lines, like story breakdown will be led by individual projects. Okay, so maybe we'll try this today. I'll put a message out in the OLM dev channel where we start breaking this milestone into individual stories, and anyone that wants to attend can attend. Does that sound good?
Sounds awesome.
Okay. Cool. Thank you guys. Sorry to like take over the direction of the meeting there. I just wanted to make sure we knew how we were going to work going forward.
I'd like to put in a quick request.
Yep.
The framework docs team would like to get involved more. So like, I don't think we can make all these or even know how to split our attention on all these smaller meetings. So I know I'm going to be trying to participate a lot more, but if like things where doc support would be helpful as things start to mature to that point, maybe ping me and Alex D and try to pull one or both of us in to know that things are starting to get to the point where it would be good to have our input and our help and potentially picking up an issue or but yeah, if until we figure out the rhythm, we'd like to be involved more. So
Michael, do you think the milestone level of information is the right level from a doc's perspective?
I've been chewing on this, and I almost think that like if the milestone level is a kind of a developer written doc that is kind of almost like peer reviewed or kind of pieced together a little bit by a writer, but then it's like 3 milestones together make like a user journey or an epic, you know, right? So that it's that bigger thing. And if maybe, because you know right now upstream we have these milestones and these very scoped user stories, and then once it gets downstream, especially with all these changes, it's a lot to kind of put that big book that big novel together, right? So if we can help iterate on these sort of smaller kind of several milestones together and be that glue that says here's a beginning, middle, and end, and I think that we could help iterate that upstream where I think, yes, being involved in seeing the milestones and helping polish those and provide feedback, but when it comes time to tie those together and to have a really good, you know, once we get beyond a README to a kind of tutorial, then I think that would be a good place for us to come in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so maybe that makes sense to me. I'm kind of thinking that like if we do things well with like the milestone refinement, then like Daniel's been talking about, like each of these things at a milestone level should be like add some user value and like be targeted to one or more personas or use cases. And so like it seems like if you're showing up to the working group meetings or if you're able to watch recordings of those, like ideally that's sufficient to at least give you like clue you in on what is going to be happening, and then we'll have the demo meetings and you can watch the demo. And then maybe what we want to do is have like a per milestone documentation sort of task that, you know, whether it's one of the engineers or whether it's you, that we pick up and we say like, okay, here's what we think needs to be documented from this milestone. We do that. It seems like we could do that sort of like once per milestone.
Yeah, I think putting a capstone, for lack of a better term, on each milestone that's like, and here's, and whether that's a README, whether it's an upstream doc, whether it's a blog post, whether it's an email, but like figuring out the different ways in which we're going to kind of open that up to people, I think, yeah, I think putting that at the end and doing that in collaboration with docs, I think would be a good thing. Yeah.
Cool. So this will be like action item. Boom. Okay, that seems reasonable. All right, we're at the top of the hour, so that's all the time we've got scheduled for today. I'm going to try and convert some of these action items into like a proposed, like a contributing guide or something for this project, if you will, just so that people know how we drive the direction of the project. Maybe I'll just do that up here, but we'll create those action items for everybody. And then if you watch the OLM dev channel later today, we'll schedule, I'll do this and I'll send a message out immediately after this meeting so we can start planning on the time we want to meet to start fleshing out this milestone. Does anybody have any last minute comments before we adjourn?
One comment I have, which is just a big thanks to everyone that showed up on short notice and contributed. And even if you didn't contribute, just we're here to take part and listen and understand the direction that we're going. I think this is absolutely awesome that we're, actually doing this all upstream and we're going to be open about it. And just, I second everything Austin was just saying there in the chat about, I think it's great that we're going to try to finally do what Chris Johnson has been asking us to do, which is to make this stuff obvious about, what we're actually working on and what's coming next. So just thanks again to everybody that's here.
Ditto. Yeah, no, it's a really exciting time, and I'm excited to see the framework grow and hopefully see outside contributors feel like they're a part of the crew. So thank you everyone who led us to this point, and I will stop my sharing and end the recording.